Welcome to the Scapegoats podcast. Here are your hosts, Matt Jamitro and Jordan Durrani, the Goats.
That's definitely where everybody turns us off. It's like these fucking jokers.
The following is intended solely for entertainment purposes and is not to be taken as financial or professional advice. The views presented are loosely held positions of the host and in no way represent any organization with which they are affiliated.
CNN Plus died a quick and painful death this week. It seems to me that they have less loyal listeners than the Scapegoats do.
If you had to be one person this week, would you rather be in Atlanta at CNN HQ or at Bill Ackman's hedge fund?
Yeah, I think that Bill Ackman is probably having some questions asked there for the audience. So Bill Ackman, his hedge fund Pershing Square, they took a large position in Netflix 3 months ago. And this week after the Netflix earnings, in which they lost 200,000 subscribers and they projected to lose another 2 million in the next quarter, Ackman decided to be fearful when others are fearful and just sell right out of his stake for a quick 3 month loss of $340 million. Just a brilliant trade on his part. I mean, I like Ackman as an investor typically, but I think that they kind of just totally misunderwrote the Netflix thesis. What do you think went wrong there?
First things first, I'm just waiting for the Twitter mob to let everyone know that based on his $340 billion loss, he could then give every person in the United States $1 billion rather than have invested into Netflix. But more generally, like this just shows how the valuation reset that's going on in large cap tech is playing out in real time across markets. Like the impact that spending $1 billion+ on shows that only your grandmother watches and she forgets how to actually tune into most of the time only serves to prove out how that is not a sustainable model. I reckon for the days of where the Netflix original content was must see television, Orange is the New Black, the Arrested Development reboot, but now it is almost attempted to go too wide and not narrow enough where the original content they produce doesn't see that continued subscriber manifestation. And I wouldn't want to be a Netflix right now. I certainly would not be buying the dip.
Yeah, I think they have a couple problems going on there. To me, the most immediately clear thing about this is they pretty drastically increased their prices, during this past quarter, as they tried to, pass on inflation costs or the higher cost of labor to consumers, which ended up, it seems like people are finally starting to push back. I mean, so that just plays out the economic slowdown thesis that we've talked about a little bit on here. But even more than that, and to your point completely, I feel like Netflix has just put out shitty content for a while now. They've kind of seemed like they've totally lapsed on their standards. They're losing ground to Apple Plus, to Disney Plus. These services that are winning Oscars or Emmys or whatever awards people care about anymore these days. I think we just tune in to see people hit each other now. But I mean, honestly, it's like and what Elon Musk said is that Netflix is failing because they've gotten eaten by the woke mind virus, which I actually kind of disagree with, because they stood up for Dave Chappelle back during that whole scandal. But I mean, the truth is, like, Netflix clearly is not growing at this pace that they were valued to grow at, and there's no way that that's going to happen when you have an economic slowdown coming. Yeah, and then this next week we're going to get all the earnings that are coming out of the other big tech companies. Do you have any views on how those are going to look?
Very telling how the market has started to price in the prospect of these high growth tech companies starting to revert back to the mean, where Amazon, Meta all had precipitous losses this past week. I think I saw Meta was down 7% 2 separate days in this past week, where the investor impetus for continuing to pile into these companies is less and less so, where they continue to see strong headwinds from labor challenges, a more competitive environment, particularly in streaming in the Netflix case. But it certainly will be telling. I personally believe that there is a outlier among those rest, which is clearly Apple, with it only being down 9 or 10% from the highs seen in Q4 2021. I think the investors are seeing that large cash balance that Tim Cook is sitting on and waiting for a potential large M&A type deal to come through the gates. Do you think there are any suitors there?
That's a great point about the cash on the balance sheet. There certainly Apple's balance sheet is a huge fortress for them. I do think that Apple was kind of already priced down a little bit because of the slowdowns that have happened in China, where they've had to shut down the Foxconn plant a few times. It does seem to me like Apple's definitely going to get hit with compressing margins a bit. I think that generally speaking, they're able to to find their way around that, and the way they do that is through essentially things like media, right? This Apple Plus play is looking like a great. They won the Oscar for the best movie with Coda. They put out some great shows. I love Severance. We Crash was just okay, but yeah, I mean it's really interesting, because Apple could go pretty much anywhere just in terms of valuation, because they're valued in such a way that you'd expect them to grow. I personally think that they're going to see compressing margins. There's not going to be as many iPhone sales as the discretionary consumer impact sort of weighs through in the same way that it has with Netflix. But I mean, it's hard to say that they're going to miss earnings when I feel like they're probably selling, a good number of iPhones. But yeah, I mean, as far as the other technology companies go, I think that they're kind of undervalued right now after all these sell-offs. Facebook, I mentioned this before, but I think they've really been turning up the dials on their engagement, just sending people random notifications for things they don't even want. And I think we'll see that. I mean, the real risk to the Facebook valuation is if you see them, go out and post a major loss in operating cash flow because they've been investing so much across the metaverse and trying to build out, new teams there. They're not producing any profits for them anymore. I think if they stay with that narrative and they're not like, hey, we were able to turn around our daily active users, then you'll see Facebook take another dive off. Google is interesting. They've kind of fallen as well. This past week was their worst week in I think years since the pandemic first hit, because they fell like 4% on Friday. It was crazy. I think part of that is regulations. The European regulations have really stepped up. They took a new step in their antitrust case against Google and Facebook this past week. And then B, it's the idea that the economy. Well, we've talked about this before as well, which is that the markets had priced in rate increases. And we'll get to the Fed and to Powell in just a second here, but they had already priced in, 9 rate hikes, but they hadn't necessarily priced in the slowdown in the economy, the slowdown in growth, because you had still been discounting those stocks at the same growth rate, but just with a higher discounting rate. So now we're seeing the other side of that flip through in this earnings, in these earnings releases, where different companies are starting to say that their margins are compressing, that their growth expectations might not be hit as well. But at the same time, as far as the past quarter goes, their past performance has probably been all right.
How much of Google's sell-off do you think was driven by the quote-unquote canary in the coal mine of advertising revenue being down across tech platforms, call it Facebook, Google, et al., where they're, to quote Mark Zuckerberg speaking in front of Congress, Senator, we sell ads. Does that speak to kind of the broader economic slowdown where, the marginal cost for acquiring consumers is going up vis-a-vis, some are other capital allocation decisions, and the impetus for selling those ads is becoming less so for, your typical folks who purchase ads on these platforms?
That's certainly the case. I think we're seeing the effects of Apple's new policy for their IDFA, which essentially says that certain apps cannot track consumers' actual identities with the data that they're getting from them if the consumer asks not to be tracked. So that's going to flow through in such a way that it makes targeted ads a lot harder to actually facilitate, and because of that, advertising becomes less attractive. To your point. Because the ads, aren't worth as much as they were before, because it costs more to acquire those new customers. Now, I think that, we'll probably see some of that with Google, but I mean, again, it's a little bit different with them since they have their own sort of platform there, through Android. I do think that part of the counter-cyclical story to Apple versus the other, large big tech names is going to be this, and that Apple doesn't really run ads, whereas all these other businesses do. And that's certainly going to be an issue for them. But, I think that the other thing to think about here is that we did actually get the Fed being a little bit more aggressive this week. We saw Powell come out, and he essentially kind of affirmed that a 50 basis point hike was on the table for this next meeting. And what was interesting is that in the market, the number of rate hikes that was priced in, the way that the futures treasuries market are looking at it, went up from 9 to 10. hikes. And there were two ideas there. Either one, there was going to be a 75 basis point hike at this next meeting, which hasn't been done like since the 90s. It's a pretty drastic move for the Fed. Or B, there's going to be 350 point hikes in a row instead of just two. Now, I mean, one thing that I think that people haven't realized, and the other thing that happened in the rates market is that treasuries on the long end of the curve sold off completely. And so that, raised all these discounting rates as well. So now you have a situation where the front end of the curve is probably moving up more quickly than was previously expected. And the long end of the curve has, followed suit and essentially said, all right, well, with inflation where it is, we got to move up. Even the real 10-year traded positively at one point this week, which just shows you that, that the rates that have been discounting these companies are certainly elevating at a rapid pace that people weren't even expecting. People did not expect the long end of the curve to start moving 20 basis points like this. And as thrilling as that is to talk about, it really does have major implications to the economy that takes some time to flow through. Another thing we saw this week is that home sales were down the most since June of 2020. Which is just kind of an incredible metric to look at the economy starting to cool as a direct result of those new rate increases. Do you see, like global monetary policy, all this tightening? What are sort of like the second order effects that you have in mind? Do you think that the market is pricing it right? Would love to get your thoughts.
And thinking about how the type of quandary that Powell is in right now, it's spurious at best, the action that he's taken in months prior, where he was slow to act in March. The messaging from the Fed was one that was a bit hard to parse through in terms of reading through the amount of rate hikes that will be sufficient to check back the high levels of inflation that we're seeing today. But he's stuck in a precarious position with how the labor market is headed. And his words about the labor market being unsustainably hot should strike fear in a lot of folks who have, at least in the past 12 to 18 months, gone out and made major purchases. You saw used car prices going up, gangbusters, housing prices doing similarly. And so where we are today kind of feels like a nexus point for the consumer, where all potential growth in these asset prices, particularly in housing and durable goods, feels more fraught going forward. And thus the impetus for making those purchasing decisions is a little bit less so when you look at, the way that housing prices have gone up in hot markets. I think I saw Miami was up 30% year over year. Austin, I'm sure, is even higher than that. A lot of those tax bills are starting to come due, to your point about taxes being fraught with peril. But, the second order effects seem interesting as a almost governor on some of the big run-ups we've seen in commodity prices. Like we talked about last week with timber prices going down 30 or 40%, the economic spark that comes with lower interest rates and the ability for consumers to continue making purchases in these large ticket type items feels, a little tough. If I was sitting on the sidelines waiting for a crash to start to deploy dollars, particularly in housing, it doesn't seem like the next 12 to 24 will find a bottom based on how massive the run-up was over the past preceding, basically since the pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's definitely a pressure on what you're saying about the consumer. I do think that, in addition to them, to it being harder to buy a house today, to it being harder to buy a car today, you also see that people probably have a large increase in the amount of debt that they have, relative to the actual earnings that each individual is bringing home. And so what that means, when we've seen consumer credit explode as far as credit cards go, home equity loans have even shot up. I mean, the problem is that when the economy all starts to slow down, all of that leverage in the system starts to become, really a huge peril for these people who've taken out this debt, because now they can't, their assets aren't worth the same that they've lended under the assumption that they have, and they have to pay back a lot of these debts, and they might lose their jobs. To your point about the labor market, and all of that is the kind of thing that really tumbles together and could lead to a systemic shock in which you see that these past 2 years of hypergrowth might not have been such a good idea, and that the economy truly was overheated, and that led to a mispricing of risk as people took out more debt, they bought more stuff, and now they can't buy more stuff, and the stuff that they sold isn't liquid anymore because people don't want to buy it with these new rates. All of that, seems to scream that there's definitely some ominous waters that the market is heading into.
It's the flip side of the wealth effect. When you look at your brokerage account and the S&P is up 25% year over year in 2021, your likelihood of going out and buying your kids frivolous items or purchasing a new home or buying that G-Wagon you've always had your eyes on becomes greater. And the flip side of that is when prices correct, your likelihood of doing so is much less. And so it creates this cascading effect where demand slows in the face of things like higher interest rates, asset prices repricing in the name of lower growth expectations in the future. It doesn't bode well for any sort of continued price run up in these in either the stock market or housing prices more generally. It feels like the back half of this year, particularly with in the context of a midterms and a president that has a low approval rating, that we're in for tough waters.
Definitely some tough waters ahead. I mean, there is a case that the market could be getting ahead of itself right now, pricing all these hikes. We haven't really seen the bulk of earnings yet. So maybe in the, short term, we could see, some of these losses recouped a little bit. But I think that, going back to your point about commodities, and if we also encompass supply chains and logistics into that, shipping has gotten so much harder. And the real key sort of linchpin in this whole system is China, where the lockdowns there over the recent COVID wave have really expanded over to, about 400 million people now, probably even more at this point. And some of them have been really drastic lockdowns like we've seen in Shanghai. I believe it's starting to spread up to Beijing now. And all of that is not good from a political standpoint for Xi Jinping, who, has this essentially vote at the end of this year where the Politburo is going to decide whether he gets to stay in power for another term. But even more importantly, when we look at this stuff like the cost of shipping something or the cost of actually creating something, these supply bottlenecks are becoming, more and more common, simply because we're getting these selective shutdowns there. We're getting manufacturing shutdowns or manufacturing slowdowns. We're getting too high of commodity prices that some manufacturers can't actually get the commodities they need. And what all that means is, more inflation, which is the reason why the Fed is doing all this, trying to raise these rates, and why we see that the economy might actually be slowing down as people see these higher prices. But the other thing is that, in order for the inflation to actually slow down and to stop, the economy has to slow down, because it's coming from all of these costs. It's coming from the inflation is coming from commodities. It's coming from the logistics of actually being able to ship something, of being able to produce it. And the only way that type of inflation goes away is if you raise rates enough to slow down and or shrink the economy, such that there's less demand for that stuff. It's not just that there's too much money in the system, like we might have thought before. So yeah, I mean, I think all of that together is going to mix together to create, sort of a hurricane at some point. The thing about recessions is that they don't just, kind of come out of nowhere as the economic system becomes more and more frail, but rather typically what would happen is that as we get into this position where, there's more and more inflation, there's, the job market is getting tighter, but also about to probably contract, you start seeing there's different opportunities for a recession to start. There's different opportunities for a huge shock to hit the system. You could argue that might happen, in the long term over what's happening in Ukraine. You could argue that it could be happening in China right now with however bad their actual lockdown gets if they're not able to stop the spread of Omicron. But it could be, something even like the consumer not being able to pay back loans and, something falling, just a few large bankruptcies in the United States as businesses that have also over-levered, have to pay back their debt too. So yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing more and more likelihood that there's some type of shock like that in the near future.
In the world is the impetus for Xi to continue these lockdowns in China. We even have disease chief expert extraordinaire Anthony Fauci basically conceding the fact that COVID is here to stay and that a zero COVID policy is never going to win out, at least in the US. So is it death driven? Is it the never waste a good crisis type fear mongering that China is known for? Like what could seriously be driving his rationale for, barricading people into their homes?
I have two theories on it. One is that, since the Chinese designed this virus in a lab in Wuhan, they might know something about the severity of it or the effects that it could have on long-term, like the health of neurons in the body. And perhaps there's some, long-term impact that will not show up for the next few years, which our physicians have somehow missed. Now, I kind of view that as unlikely and as sort of a conspiracy theory, but I might as well throw it out there because, why else are we doing this? But the second and probably more likely reason that Xi is sticking to this plan is that he's trying to keep his power consolidated. And while the population is locked down as it is, well, it's put in a position where, yeah, like you said, people are being locked into their apartments, and he's able to, go out and actually put an iron fist or an iron grip on any of the local party officials in order to make them, totally focused on these lockdowns and controlling power in that way. It's almost like a way to distract the population from any other problems that they're having, because China was probably going to contract their economy anyways, right? They had done all of this, regulation where they've been, essentially stepping in on the tech companies. They had stepped in on the property sector, which is still collapsing, by the way. I feel like, everybody is sort of leaving that domino off the table, even though those companies are doing, very poorly. And these lockdowns are certainly magnifying the crisis there. You see people fleeing Hong Kong, trying to go to Singapore, and they're not even able to because you have to pay like millions of dollars to do that at this point. There's a lot of stress that's happening in China right now. And so Xi having, this extreme power grab where he's able to, assert just these intense, almost Sharia law, or not Sharia law, but martial rule, where he's using the military essentially to fight off this enemy. He's making the political enemy of the country COVID rather than himself, which is what could happen if people really got, as upset as they possibly could. And I think that there is a case that could backfire on him. I mean, to your point, it's clearly, reverberating around the West that this is a super dangerous man, and the things he's doing are actually human rights violations, right? People are dying, people's pets are getting killed for no reason. People, tons of people locked away. It's truly a tragedy. It's truly a tragedy.
How do you think about China easing monetary policy right now vis-a-vis Western institutions where, Powell comes out and talks about how 50 bip rate hikes are on the table. There's a possibility of a jumbo hike, a 75 bip hike in the near future too. How do you square that circle where China seems to be easing policy, making things more stimulatory from an economic perspective versus here where we're trying to turn off the spigot and put out the flames?
Yeah, I think that's totally related to, the Politburo meeting that'll happen later this year, where they'll make the vote on whether Xi can stay in power for this, third term, which is not usually what happens. It's certainly, a complicated situation. I don't know. I think that, what's going to end up happening is that, man, what was your question again? I lost my train of thought there.
We've seen massive moves in the yuan this past week. The yen exploded like crazy. Those seem to be the quote unquote type of crisis catalysts that spark the overall deleveraging type events that cause financial crashes, so to speak.
Yeah, and and to your point, they certainly are taking the opposite path in their monetary policy. I think part of that is that they had the room to do it. China's rates were already, I think, around 5 or 6%. But also the way that they can stimulate stuff is much different than the United States, because the government spending that they do is much more direct in the way that it impacts the economy. Whereas in the United States, we pass this CARES Act, and there's billions of dollars in fraud that happen, right, where people are just able to take out money from that system, and it's not, it probably wasn't managed in the best way that it could have been. In China, they do have a more direct approach of being stimulatory in that they can actually go in and they can invest not just directly in the companies, but the banks can do special type of lending that you wouldn't actually normally do. That's totally guaranteed by the government. I think that they have a situation there where they've set up their economy to be able to do this. And the other thing is that China is a currency manipulator. And they really have gotten away with this for a long time, but the onshore yuan is different from the offshore yuan. So what's traded, in international waters, or if someone in the United States wants to make a bet on the currency or they want to buy a bunch of it, they're not getting the same thing, the same supply of money that they would have onshore in China. So you end up seeing that they're able to do, these kind of drastic things with their monetary policy that aren't actually in step with what's happening in terms of the IMF or the world central banks that are realizing this stuff. It makes me wonder whether China's going to experience massive inflation that they don't see coming as well, which maybe they're only avoiding because they keep getting commodities from Russia.
I saw an interesting chart this past week where if you overlaid the largest moves in the yuan versus the S&P over the past 10 or 15 years, the biggest moves in the yuan, when they decrease vis-a-vis the dollar about 10 or 15% or more, those types of moves match nearly perfectly with drawdowns in the S&P 500. The last time that it happened was in late 2018, where the yuan spiked precipitously. This was the end of year sell-off that we saw in the stock market, where there were a lot of confounding type issues with the Trump administration, where we saw things going 2019 heading forward, but certainly something to think about. Another interesting cross asset type thing where if you were to borrow in Japanese yen and invest into the S&P 500, you would have never seen a drawdown during that period. You would be going completely up and to the right forever. So is that the investment advice that you can give? Borrow Shinzo, sell US?
We're getting into some complex trading territory here at the cross asset swaps. But what essentially is happening is because the demand for dollars is higher than the demand for yen, and because the Japanese central bank keeps the rates essentially negative on a real basis, borrowing that yen allows you to invest in the S&P at a much cheaper rate than you'd be able to. The fact that it's continued to work is just kind of amazing. I think that probably it gets tight at some point when the United States starts cutting its monetary policy. But it is incredible that the yen has been, that the Japanese central bank has kind of just taken on this, this type of economics where they essentially say that our goal is just to kind of be steady. We don't care about growing that much. And I mean, it's kind of worked for them, but at the same time, it's sort of a stagnant economy.
This is where every Instagram high school guy that you went to school with tries to get you into Forex trading. The Escape Goats podcast is about to become their literal Bible. You're about to get multi-level marketing schemes like thrown out the window. You're about to get pitched this constantly, and just know who your daddy is. The Escape Goats sent you.
Yeah, we're trading all sorts of currencies these days. Crypto, FX. Well, honestly, we've talked about pretty much every asset class here, which is kind of cool. I feel like you don't usually get that view in the markets, and perhaps we're being a bit amateurish about some of them, but no, that's not even true. We're killing it.
One last thing before we leave the heady world of FX. For all you listeners out there, I'd love to see a chart that interpolates the rise in the S&P with the rise in CumRocket coin. If you can think of any, borrowing opportunities in CumRocket and then putting into the S&P, we're all ears. We'll send you out next podcast.
Man, another reason I actually think that the market sold off this past week was speculation over the French election that just happened. And I guess we can just touch on it real quick. It would have been more interesting if Le Pen won, because that probably would have been, the end of the EU and the total destabilization of Europe and probably thermonuclear war eventually. But Le Pen lost to Macron today. It was interesting. The last time Macron beat Le Pen, he won 66% of the vote. This year, he only won 57%. So you can see that, there is a shift happening in French politics. But there were a ton of articles that came out this week where it seemed like people were almost saying that Le Pen was going to win. Thank God she didn't. Macron has kind of just been LARPing as a wartime leader, which is silly in its own right, considering that he's just been an ineffectual negotiator, really. But yeah, I think that was another risk that the market was sort of worried about this week that'll probably maybe get alleviated over the next week.
Shout out Marine Le Pen. Shout out Marine Le Pen's, I think it's her niece, total dime. I think she's in the National Front as well. Nothing like a fascist hottie that we all know and love.
Yeah. It was her dad's party before Marine Le Pen. So she's been carrying on the family tradition of far-right nationalism, which I guess is kind of the point of far-right nationalism.
Nothing like those family values.
Yeah. Go for it.
No, the last French leader to get reelected was in 2002. So at the point now that you've lost twice and you've let Macron win again, do you call it quits, or is there, another National Front type leader in the future that, seizes the day?
I think it keeps going. That was a fascinating sort of point that there hasn't been, an incumbent that won in France over the past 2 decades. I think that just tells you so much about French politics and how whimsical it is, and based on what's happening in the populist sentiment there. We'll see if things continue. I think one of the main reasons why people were upset about Macron in France is that he had really increased the surveillance state there. They had sent out these drones that were watching people in the big cities. There were a few terrorist attacks in France, and I think that he kind of never wasted a crisis in that sense. I mean, the interesting thing is that it really would have just destabilized the country to have a national, or destabilized Europe to have a nationalist like Le Pen come in. But speaking of nationalists, Trump endorsed JD Vance in Ohio this week, who used to be a never Trumper. Is that right? Do you have any thoughts on that endorsement?
Crazy for starters that Trump has deviated from his typical path of insane loyalty as his real litmus test for whether or not he supports you. You're either part of the party or you're against him. Now it seems like he's taking a pragmatic turn. I wonder if it's a knock-on effect from the 2020 election, Trump realizing that this wing of the Republican Party has room to run vis-a-vis the triangulation, quote unquote, where he both married the somewhat libertarian religious right type wings of the party with the more nationalist side of the House. But it does speak pretty candidly about where the party is going and how that jockeying for Trump's respect and endorsement going forward is one that doesn't necessarily require you to have towed the line on him previously.
Yeah, that was a surprise in that sense. But I mean, if you look at who's supporting Trump the most right now, it's probably someone like Peter Thiel, who's also a big booster for JD Vance and for Blake Masters, who's running in Arizona. Their whole political philosophy is. It's a trip, man. There was a great article I sent you this week that was in Vanity Fair that was about the new right. And I think you're right that it is, in some ways a combination of that, more religious right with the nationalistic right. But there's also just this idea that, what's happened in the United States is that money has gotten so involved in politics and that, lobbying has become like this kind of, behind the scenes octopus that sort of runs things and in turn with the media. And so, people like JD Vance have been able to take advantage of that sentiment, and even though he's like Yale educated lawyer, he basically is going to talk down to the populism and try to boost up those types of sentiments. I don't know what it means in the long term, but it certainly seems to be where the party is going. I would not doubt that one bit.
He have his book Hillbilly Elegy made as a Netflix original series or movie. The fact that I don't know about it probably speaks volume to how Netflix shouldn't be spending on that type of shit anyways, but kind of interesting crossplay.
Definitely. The other interesting news from the Republican Party this week was Disney in Florida. And Florida passed, the bill to repeal Disney's special district status there, which who knew? Disney World is actually just like a fiefdom. It's like its own little Vatican Republic or Vatican state right there. Do you have any thoughts on Disney making that move or on Florida making that move?
Nothing like shooting yourself in the foot. In a world in which Disney is the biggest employer in the area, the one main draw to go to the fucking swampland that is Central Florida. I don't understand why you continue to go to war with your main reason for folks to continue to go in, spend money, go to the most magical place on earth, all for these political games that it's unclear to me that they're going to pay dividends for continued success in Florida. I mean, Florida is not a deep red state. It's a perpetual purple state. And these types of culture war type antics where you cast a boogeyman in terms of a large corporation feel a little bit misguided, and it only serves to show how a company like Disney, with its long entrenched tentacles across the United States and into the culture more generally, can start to make plans to build another theme park elsewhere. They've been historically linked to spaces in central West Texas, some places in the Midwest as well. Like Disney does not necessarily need to be a permanent fixture of Central Florida. And we kind of saw that with Disneyland. I mean, Disneyland vis-a-vis Disney World has dropped in visitors versus the most magical place on earth in the penis of the United States. So it certainly, it feels like.
Wait, are you saying Disneyland has less people going there than Disney World, or the other way around?
That they have both less people going there and that their growth in visitors is less than Disney World. Granted, that there are a couple of different factors there. They've invested a lot more in Disneyland versus Florida versus Disney. They've invested more in Disney World than Disneyland. Disneyland's land constrained, so they can't grow as much. They've got this massive plot in the Evergrands that they can always continue to build out through.
Right.
But it's strange. It feels like DeSantis angling.
So on the one hand, I agree with you that the Republicans are kind of just going a little too far with the culture war to the point where it's annoying. Same sort of thing with Greg Abbott busing illegal immigrants crossing the border to D.C. Just kind of pointless stuff that probably is further than they need to go in terms of their culture war. But on the other hand, I do think that Disney fucked up here. And I think that Bob Chapek, I don't know how to say it, the new CEO of Disney, it really made a mistake by waffling on this thing, right? Because originally Disney said they weren't going to make any comment on this Don't Say Gay bill. And then, there was some pushback within the company, like, people calling for him to make a change, or people even calling for him to be ousted, actually. And he basically came back and said, all right, you know what? We oppose the bill now. And, that obviously pissed off Ron DeSantis to a huge degree. And I mean, it is part of, what the Republicans are saying now, which is that corporations should not be activists in politics. And so I get it from the ideological side of what they're going for. Like I said, I do think it's just an annoying culture war distraction. But at the same time, Disney making this move is not good for them, right? Even if they are to invest in these new theme parks in other places, or if they're trying to do something, I mean, to the point you just made, they've invested a lot in Disney World. And it is their best theme park in the world. And it is, it did have special tax status, and it did, have certain things that were granted to the place that they just aren't going to have anymore. And perhaps there's going to be even more regulation where where the Republicans start saying you can't have certain types of imagery inside of Disney World, right? So it could quickly roll downhill, and it's all because the CEO decided to get involved with the activist campaign when really he seemed like he just kind of folded to the media in that sense, and I think that was a mistake.
I think it's going to be very tough for a company like Disney to not be beholden to those type of employer-based interests because of how many people they employ, the sheer magnitude of their labor force in Disney World, and more broadly across its global platform, but also more generally that as a media company, and one that continues to further either explicitly or implicitly its own political agenda through imagery, through the different productions that they have, that will inevitably cause themselves to have to take stances on these types of issues. It's the question about what races are the Disney princesses, whether, you show LGBT relationships in these types of movies or kids-based media. And so it feels tough, at least from Disney's seat, to shy away from those types of issues because of how entrenched their products are in the overall, lexicon.
I agree to a certain extent. I mean, I think that, just bowing to identity politics is a way to, make enemies quickly, which seems to be what has happened. But on the other hand, you're right. There are issues that they have to think about. I mean, maybe it's even time, for a broader national conversation. And I mean, I guess this is kind of what the Republicans are angling for, which is, how should young children be educated about these topics, and how should we be able to think about them in a way, that more people can agree on. I do hate to see just how divisive it's become, and I think that's really going to be the end problem, is that this, if this keeps being a thematic thing, it's going to come down to, what do the most parents agree with? And it'll be interesting to see. I would love to see some updated polls on what's happening in Florida right now, and see, does DeSantis really have a grip on power there? Is this redistricting that they just did, cementing them now to be a red state for the future? I guess we could do some deeper research into Florida politics before we go there.
Yeah, I need to brush up on my civics. Maybe
learn some more about the swamp.
Go to Disney World, write it off on the taxes.
Let's take a trip to Miami. Actually, that sounds pretty fun. Man, I mean, other stuff in politics this week. There was the ruling in a Florida court, actually, I think near Tampa, that there can be no more mask requirements on planes and in airports, or I think it's just on planes. I thought that was a pretty, fascinating turnaround. I wonder, I don't really feel like it's going to increase COVID cases. It seems like most people are kind of, okay with it. All the videos of people celebrating afterward were fascinating. I think the Biden administration should just take the W here. I don't know, or take the L here, I guess, depending how you look at it. But for some reason, they've decided that the Justice Department needs to actually fight this and, consolidate their executive power. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I continue to think that any using a 2020 lens to evaluate 2022 policy is always going to be a losing battle. The fact that, the broad swath of the population does not want to wear a mask on planes, especially from my seat in Texas, where I literally wear a mask nowhere else, and putting one on in a plane seems counterintuitive at best, given that I have to go into either a crowded store or walk through, malls, shopping centers, and the like, where I don't wear a mask in those situations, but somehow being in a confined environment where around other people with these big investment in quote unquote air conditioning services and sanitization that these airlines have all done over the past 2 years as a feel good measure to prevent the spread of COVID, that we have to take that win and recognize when we either go by the wayside and let COVID continue to control our daily life, or B, take the route of Anthony Fauci now and move on with it. Learn that zero COVID is not a winning policy, both politically and practically in American life. And, we have to move on from the pandemic. That's what separates us from Xi and the Chinese.
Yeah. What was it? At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people did not want to go into lockdown. At the end of the pandemic, a lot of people don't want to come out of lockdown on the other side, essentially. I think that I agree with you for sure. I mean, it seems like, keeping fighting for those type of mandates is really a power play. And I think it's actually good that we're sort of rolling back some of the powers that we've given to these public health authorities, where they've been able to do things like claim that they are science, whereas science is a process of discovery. It's just absurd. We learn new things about health and medicine every day, but to your point, I think that people are just done with it. And even another fact on top of that is that the airlines, economically, they really need this, right? People are buying flights like pretty consistently still. But once you see this, these economic effects we've talked about roll through, the people who are buying tickets are not going to want to pay the heightened prices that they are. The airlines have been pushing on a ton of costs to consumers that they're facing from higher jet fuel costs, that they're facing, from higher replacement and repair parts. It's definitely, a situation for them where they don't want to have just another thing like, oh, and you have to wear a mask. You have to pay twice as much for a ticket, and you have to wear a mask, and, you're probably going to fight with the flight attendant. Speaking of which, did you see the video of Mike Tyson punching the guy out who was behind him on the plane?
Jesus, no, I didn't.
Oh man, so this guy was like instigating Mike Tyson, just clearly trying to bother him. Stupid strategy, by the way. Mike Tyson turns around in the seat behind him and just whacks the guy. And what did you expect, right? This. Yeah, I can't imagine trying to bother Mike Tyson on a flight.
What in the fuck? Was he trying to win internet points or win was he fulfilling a dare or something? Who in their right fucking mind is I'll pick a fight with Mike fucking Tyson?
For real. And, the funny thing about it is there was a JetBlue flight, and everybody that I saw commenting was like, why was Mike Tyson flying JetBlue?
Deep thickets.
Yeah, man, crazy.
My God, that just shows how depraved our society is. That is, oh man. I'd love to see what that guy's day-to-day life is. I imagine he sells insurance somewhere, and this is now his calling card. He's got a imprint of some world heavyweight championship ring in his side cheek. It's look what I did.
Yeah, he's posting on TikTok. This is probably one of the best moments of this guy's life, and he's definitely going to sue Mike Tyson. It kind of sucks. But yeah,
that's one of his tigers.
That would be a hilarious court loss. The tiger would probably eat the guy. That's just karma. Yeah. Did you see that Obama gave a speech at Stanford this week where he's starting a campaign which I like to call InfoWars after Alex Jones because he was ahead of his time. But Obama's starting this campaign against disinformation, the InfoWars. And he's basically going around to, campuses and saying, that these social media companies have polarized the United States and that it's, all of these problems that are happening with disinformation spreading, misinformation spreading. Do you think that this is the next movement for the left for the party, for the Democrats?
First things first, very convenient to call social media companies the champions of disinformation after you spend 2 election cycles raking in money from Zuckerberg, Gates,
winning off it. Yeah.
Very, very convenient. My second takeaway was that, putting the politics of that aside, it's so incredibly crazy how much more articulate and strong-willed and more of a leader he is than Joe Biden. And I think this was evidenced even further by when Obama visited the White House. Joe was he was cast away as the less important figure in the room. Everyone was just jockeying to try and get in front of Obama. But going back to the disinformation point, it is very funny that a architect of disinformation is in its own right, with his myriad claims about, the threat that Trump poses to the country, or how, election fraud may be a talking point on the right, where it almost seems like he is just angling the opposite side now and using his pulpit that he had previously for being an ex-president as now talking points for Democratic viewpoints. I mean, the precedent previously was that presidents went off and built houses or painted paintings of themselves in showers, but now Obama is doing the speaker tour. I wonder what his bank account looks like after Spotify cut his recent deal. He probably needs more speaking engagements.
Yeah, his podcast company is probably not doing so hot without Spotify. But yeah, I agree. I think that, for one, the point about Biden versus Obama is pretty hilarious. Those videos of him in the room where Obama was just getting mobbed by all the people, and Biden was just like, all right, well, I'm going to walk over here now. That was unreal to see. It definitely seems that, Biden has kind of become a figurehead, and that maybe his cognitive capacities are not totally there, whereas Obama's definitely still are. Now, do I think Obama's fighting an odd fight here? Yeah, I do, because, disinformation has become this rallying cry of the left, essentially, where they've been able to essentially say, anything that I don't like probably comes from a foreign actor. That's pretty wrong, I think. I mean, it's not happening universally, but I think that it's kind of the trend that they're trying to lean into now. And so I have to wonder, how much of the read through here is that this is the only avenue that they actually see to winning, is that in terms of the politics itself, if they start claiming that disinformation is a huge problem, why are they trying to, undermine, what people think based on, what they believe is information, what's not. I've seen multiple things in which the Democratic Party has actually done disinformation, and it seems to me to be a little bit convenient for them, especially after, like he said, he won the elections as being the first social media president, which, to be fair, he did acknowledge in his speech. But also, I mean, he trumpeted the Arab Spring back in, the early 2010s, and, the use of social media, that it could actually be great for democracy. When have we actually changed our viewpoint here? And why did that polarization happen and the claims start happening, after you do things like, lose to someone like Trump, who just happened to be a Twitter savant, and you claim that things are disinformation when they clearly weren't. Like the Hunter Biden laptop thing, here's a great point of disinformation, which we talked about before, but Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer getting canceled. What is, actually considered disinformation, and what's considered an information operation, where you're trying to convince people of things? I think that line has become very blurry, and I think it's a weird place for the Democrats to lean in. And I don't think that avenue is going to end up winning them as much as they think they can.
This is right out of the Trump playbook, too. Trump was the fake news champion. Yeah, he brought the notion of broad swath dismissal of the other party's platform points as a winning strategy previously. And it seems like the Democrat and Obama route for this is just to make it more prosaic with Harvard infused language and do essentially the same song and dance. Going back to the previous kind of how Democrats use disinformation as a means of furthering their objectives, I think it rhymes very nicely with how we approach COVID over the past 12 months. They were the party of more lockdowns, more self-imposition, more mask usage, and that deviated from the very biblical type reliance on science that they championed. And that just shows how disinformation is not squarely on the shoulders of one party. It is a tool in the Democrat or in the political operating platform to further your own ends.
For sure. It seems to me like the the theory of knowledge or the epistemology that the Democrats use is pragmatism. And the Republicans do this too, but in terms of like social sciences, this ends up being the case a lot, where the truth is what is convenient to be the truth. It's what's useful to be the truth. Whereas in reality, we know that something like science, believes that truth is fallible, and that, people should be able to question assumptions in order to test them, to actually see, like, is this something, that holds up to experimentation, that holds up to real experience. Now, I don't understand why we're so worried about disinformation on the internet, and we're not doing things like saying, like, hey, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. We need to just separate it out and say the internet is not truth. It never will be. It's never going to be. There will always be disinformation in some way. There will always be disagreements about what is true and what is not. And to me, it makes no sense to have such a ploy.
Out on this podcast, though, only real news on the Escape Goats podcast.
All we know is truth.
Part of our epistemology.
It was interesting watching CNN die, or CNN Plus die this past week. Where they had invested $100 million in a streaming platform, and they couldn't even make like 3 good shows that would convince people to sign up for it. I mean, that just shows you that the types of politics, or the types of aesthetics even that Democrats have approached in the past, are no longer working for them.
Well, who the hell did they think was going to subscribe to that platform? What super fans of CNN exist in a post 2020, post 2020 or 2016 world? Their name has been dragged in the mud so aggressively that I don't know who is a ardent supporter of CNN broadly. Like, they don't have a captive audience in the same way that Fox News is curated, or even to a lesser extent MSNBC or some of the liberal leaning platforms. Like, they have just shown themselves to have played their hand too hard with both the identity politics game, the COVID aggression, the constant trumpeting of war when the Ukraine conflict was reaching ahead. It doesn't surprise me at all that they took the L on that one.
Yeah, they are under new ownership now, so that's another reason it probably got cut quickly under, I guess, Discovery. And I guess the guy who is now taking over running CNN after, what's his name, Jeff Zucker, got taken out by Chris Cuomo's lawsuit of all things, where he said that he was unfairly terminated. And so then this guy named Chris Licht, I think is his name.
Pretty fitting that the recording stopped when we started trashing CNN.
Wow, that was fucked. Talk about information operations going on here. Shit.
I think we just got nuked.
Seriously. I said the guy's name once, and that fucking got us. Anyways, as I was saying, Chris Licht is taking over CNN. He used to be the showrunner for Stephen Colbert's show right now. So I don't know if it's going to stop being pretty far, left. But he has said that he was going to try to bring CNN back to being, journalistically and to have journalistic integrity, which just shows you that they don't or they haven't had it for a while now.
Talk about saying the quiet part out loud. I guess what type of prior state are they returning to, being the most trusted name in airport watching journalism?
I feel like the only purpose for CNN at this point is just to give election maps that look pretty and have someone stand by them.
Just draw a bunch of circles on it. Even that has been taken over by the dude on MSNBC, the nerdy looking guy.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, the champion of gay rights.
Right. I don't know his name.
Which says a lot, honestly.
Well, yeah, I'm not an MSNBC consumer, but I think our audience knew that already.
And if we said it, I'm sure Zoom would just perma-nuke us.
For sure. At least we got back online for a couple minutes here. Man, the last thing we could touch on that we've skipped is that Tesla had earnings this week, and they came out looking good. We kind of, this is sort of what we said last week, is that they've sold all the cars they possibly can. They've had, some manufacturing problems in China. They've definitely seen much higher costs from commodities. And that's, something that was like hugely talked about on the call. But even still, their growth prospects are looking good. And Elon's got new ideas coming, like this robo taxi. He's got an AI, humanoid robot that's coming out, theoretically, at least. I don't know. The company is still performing pretty well, if you ask me, even though the valuation is really high.
What's the deal with the robo taxis? Is this the ability to use? Is it car fleet as a service where you can let your autonomous Tesla start taking people around when you're not using it?
So firstly, that's kind of my hope as a Tesla owner, that I'll be able to do that someday and turn it into a cash flow positive asset, just driving people around. But actually what Elon said a couple of weeks ago is that this new robo taxi will not have any steering wheel or pedals. It'll just be an actual pod that you get into and then get driven somewhere, which will definitely, freak some people out. But I think that the timeline he's given is that he's been wrong on these timelines, a lot, but essentially that Tesla will achieve, self-driving to the point where it's safer than a human driving by the end of this year, which I think is plausible. Like their neural networks set up and the amount of data that they've collected and the, types of GPUs that are using are all very, very state of the art. And there have been a ton of breakthroughs in terms of computer vision and in terms of, these large language models that are used to allow the car essentially to think through problems in real time. It's incredible. And it'll probably, be here within the next year or two. Now, at the point where it actually gets regulated and where they can actually make these robo taxis, that's probably going to take some more time. They're probably only going to be in places like Miami and Austin at first. But it's going to happen in these next few years, I think.
What does that say for the future of Uber, Lyft at all?
It's not so rosy, I guess. I mean, unless Uber and Lyft, decide they're going to buy a bunch of autonomous vehicles, which is good for Tesla. It's hard to see them being able to, compete on a margin basis. And I mean, with commodities price where they are, the fact that most Uber drivers are driving, gas powered cars, that's a problem too for them, where they're going to have, higher costs in terms of their drivers. Less people are going to, are going to have the demand to drive. So yeah, I don't know. It doesn't bode well. I mean, and Uber and Lyft still are not, money making businesses, right? Like they post losses all the time. So yeah,
especially with the fuel surcharges that have been added to both Uber and Lyft. This seems like a natural way to combat those with free market type expressions like robo taxis. I would be a little fraught getting into one of those, particularly knowing the track record of self-driving cars, bursting into flames, or I think this past week it drove into a marijuana dispensary, which is just that feels like an AI generated Elon Musk story almost. Like all you needed was a reference to a threesome with Amber Heard, and you check all the boxes on the Elon Musk bingo card.
Man, Elon really destroyed Johnny Depp's life, huh?
Talk about it all coming out in the wash too, where not only is the guy a pop culture icon with his constant Twitter flaming, his tweets this week about Bill Gates shitting on him for being short Tesla, but now he also gets tons of pussy too. Who would have thought? What a guy!
He's a modern day Renaissance man. Elon Musk, incredible. But man, that Johnny Depp, man, that trial was crazy. I kind of believe him, not gonna lie. I saw a post that was like, it had a picture of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and then of Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith. And it was like, the era of toxic femininity begins.
They get paid more than us now. They can hit us whenever they want. They make us hit other people.
What is happening?
Brave new world.
God. Yeah. Well, I guess I feel like that's a good ending point. Brave new world.
Shout out to our non-existent advertisers. Looking forward to shilling KY Jelly and Stitch Fix, Stamps.com.
Ads coming next week. Look out for them. You'll hopefully enjoy them and find something good to buy.
I've already planned out my product placement. This episode of the Scapegoats podcast has been brought to you by KY Jelly. With his with his approval rating in the shitter, don't you think Joe Biden could use some right about now?
Oh man, that's a good one. I still like liquid IV. I inject it into my veins every day. We're gonna have some good ones. I have no doubt about that.
I can't wait for that email. It's like, I hope that this message finds you well, Escape Ghost hosts. Please refrain from any editorializing in these advertisements. You guys are, to quote our intro, a bunch of fucking jokers.